I'm Sandra Sarjono from the Tracing Patterns Foundation.
And I'm Chris Buckley.
In this talk, we're going to share with you some weaving tradition and textiles from the area of Minangkabau in West Sumatra, Indonesia. This region is very famous for its songket textiles, which are normally made of silk and heavily decorated with gold and silver yarns.
So in September 2019, we made a visit to this area, partly to look at the textiles, which are beautiful and which we'll show you some of shortly, but also to look at the weaving techniques that these weavers are using, both the most traditional ones and also some of the ways in which Minangkabau weavers are adapting their weaving technology to meet the needs of the modern world. We'll also show you an interesting discovery, which we think is the first evidence of the direct involvement of Indian weavers in weaving in Indonesia. As we mentioned, Minangkabau is famous for its songket textiles. Songket is cloth decorated with gold or silver yarns, usually as supplementary wefts. Some songket are entirely covered with gold and silver pattern wefts, so that you can hardly see the colour of the foundation weave, which is often in red silk. Minangkabau songket has become quite well known in the last few decades, and old songket cloths have been featured in publications and museum exhibitions. The focus on songket has tended to overshadow the fact that the repertoire of techniques in this region was once a lot wider. It included everyday cloths woven from cotton, such as this headcloth, and other decorative techniques, such as these weft ikat designs. Minang people are outward-looking and entrepreneurial, and many families were involved in the extensive trade in spices and textiles that was conducted via Sumatra. This trade connected Sumatra with India, China, and with Europe. The wealth that these families accumulated was expressed partly in textiles. Gold and silver yarns were obtained from India and China through trade. The gold yarns are actually mostly silver, with a thin layer of gold on top of a silver substrate. Many songket textiles are heavy to handle, and most of their weight is made up of silver. Special yarns, like the spring-like fringes on this textile, were imported from Europe. Several kinds of textiles were made in the Minangkabau region, including sarongs for men in tubular form, like this one, and selendang or shoulder cloths, such as this.
One of our reasons for visiting this region was to look for a traditional method of patterning involving bamboo sticks called lidi, which are placed in the warp to save pattern sheds on a temporary basis. When we look at this old photograph of a Minangkabau loom from circa 1890, we can see that one of the distinguishing features of the loom is the frame, where the weaver sits on a bench and she uses foot treadles to operate two heddles to make plain weave. This is in contrast to looms in most other parts of Indonesia, where the weaver sits on the ground and uses a backstrap loom that is attached to her body. In this loom, the heddles are operated by her hands. In old photographs of Minangkabau looms, there are often two women. One is a weaver, the other is her assistant who operates the bamboo pattern sticks. Most weavers today operate these looms by herself, perhaps because there are fewer women weaving. Before our visit, we were told that this method was already extinct, replaced by more efficient techniques. However, we chance upon one weaver who is still using it. This is Ibu Milda Yani, who belongs to the 8th generation of weavers in her family. She lives in a traditional Minang house called Rumah Gadang in Pandai Sike. The house has a tiered roof and the outside is decorated with elaborate carved designs. The house is said to be 400 years old. The inside is one large open space supported by beautifully decorated wooden pillars. Ibu Yani weaves songket in the traditional way, which involves picking up warps by hand, either from memory or by following a sampler or a pattern on graph papers. As she inserts each row of pattern wefts using gold thread, she also places a bamboo stick in the same opening and pushes it to the back of the loom. The design is symmetrical. When she has completed half of the design, instead of picking the other half by hand, she can use the bamboo sticks that she put in place, this time in reverse order, pulling them forward and removing them one by one. Although this is not a permanent way to store the design, it reduces her work in picking out warps for the pattern by half. As you will see, she manages to perform the whole operation by herself without an assistant. Ibu Yani and her mother weave songket for the local market. Mostly, they weave a pair of cloths consisting of a selendang and a sarong, which are worn at weddings and special occasions. Some items are made to order, but they also have samples of their work in their home. Ibu Yani also records her motifs using small samplers of cotton. These samplers show the patterns in enlarged form so that they are easy to follow. Some samplers were made by her mother and grandmother as well.
This weaving method using bamboo sticks was once the main method for weaving songket cloth in this region, but many weavers in this area have switched to a more efficient method that seems to have been imported from Malaysia, which lies just to the north over the Straits of Malacca. The loom is basically the same, but instead of recording the weft insertions with bamboo sticks, they're saved permanently on a bunch of heddles, which are the red threads in this picture. Each heddle records one weft insertion, and they're lifted one by one to make the pattern. These can be used again and again, unlike the bamboo lidi that have to be removed and reinserted. Some of the commercial workshops, such as this one, are using the same method. In the Minangkabau area, weaving for the local market is an important industry. This has led to some specialization. This family in Selongkang, for example, specializes in setting up the warp for looms. Weavers send their warp beam, heddles, and the reed from their loom to the family, who prepare it for them. The completed warp is sent back rolled into a bundle to the weaver. The owner of the warp, its length and colour are noted on each bundle. This family, consisting of a mother, grandmother and daughter, has been doing this work for at least 3 generations. They do very little weaving themselves, and warping is now their main job. When the weaver receives the bundle, she simply unrolls it, slots the warp beam into the back of her loom, hooks up the heddles and reed, and she's ready to begin weaving. The competition for the Minang weavers now comes partly from machine-driven looms like those at the nearby Taltex factory and partly from imports. As a result, it's now uneconomic for a hand weaver to make a simple cotton sarong, for example. To survive, the hand weavers have to focus on more intricate traditional cloths that are difficult to weave by machine, such as the songket cloths used for weddings. Some workshops that we visited have also introduced some novel techniques that are helping the handloom weaving industry to survive. At a weaving workshop in Bukit Tinggi, the Swiss couple, Erika and Bernhard Barth, have taught Minang weavers to use a patterning method copied from Laos and Thailand. They learned this method from Carol Cassidy, who's a well-known weaver and director of a weaving workshop in Vientiane in Laos. In this method, the weaver stores the pattern in a web of cords suspended above and below the warp. Each cord is used in turn before being moved below the warp. When the cords are all used up, the weaver reverses direction to weave a symmetrical design. This method can store a complex pattern in a very compact form. This system of pattern cords allows a permanent record of the design. It can be removed from the loom and reused at another time. For a large and complicated design, one loom can have 2 or more of these sets of pattern cords at the same time. Bernhard and Erica have also researched the use of local natural dyes, such as sapanwood, which was traditionally used to make the rich, dark red ground that many old Songket cloths display. They've also imported high-quality gold and silver yarns to complete their cloths. Some cloths have traditional designs, and some have new motifs created by Bernhard.
At another workshop in Payakumbuh, we saw a loom called the ATBM being used. ATBM is an acronym for Alat Tenun Bukan Mesin, or non-machine weaving tool. This loom was developed in Indonesia during the colonial era and has been promoted by the government since that time. It has an ingenious system that connects a fly shuttle to the reed beater so that the weaver can insert the weft and beat it in just by pulling the beater forward. In Kota Tinggi, there is a workshop using an ingenious low-cost pattern loom developed for them by the Institute of Technology Bandung. Motifs are recorded on slots that are cut out of strips of wood. Each strip records 1 weft insertion. You can see the motifs on the edges of the bundles of strips, which resemble the punch cards used by old-style jacquard looms. The principle of operation is conceptually similar to a jacquard loom, but the mechanism is different in detail. All of the weavers in this workshop are young men, in contrast to the women we saw weaving in homes and other workshops. We see this trend as a characteristic of commercial weaving. Men tend to become involved once weaving becomes a full-time profession rather than a domestic activity. The border and the center part of the design on this loom are controlled by separate jacquard systems. But despite its automated appearance, this is still a hand loom, operated by hand and foot, with the weft inserted by hand. It is being used to make some very beautiful and intricate cloths with traditional design. The approach here reminds us very much of hand weaving of saris in Indian workshops, which use a similar hand-operated jacquard approach, though the details of the looms are different.
The last topic we want to share with you is the discovery that a few Minang weavers are using a warping technique that seems to have originated in India. Though the details of this loom have been published before, its Indian origins have been overlooked. Before we get to the loom, a little bit of background is in order. Over the last 2,000 years, there have been extensive contacts between India and Indonesia. This has influenced many aspects of Indonesian life, including language, cuisine, government, and religion. The great Buddhist monument of Borobudur, as well as the stone temples of the Dieng Plateau in Java, are in essence Indian designs translated onto Indonesian soil. This influence extends to tastes in textiles. Indian printed cottons and woven silks were imported into Indonesia in quantity, and their designs and layouts were reinterpreted in local Indonesian forms. In Sumatra, the large cloths made by Batak people clearly show the influence of Indian textiles in their layout and in the ikat bars and chevrons in the design. Similar stripes and chevrons cloths occur in Aceh in northern Sumatra. The form and layout of songkets made in the Palembang area to the south also show clear influence from Indian trade cloths. The famous double ikat gringsing too is likely to be influenced by Indian patola double ikat designs. Despite this Indian influence, all of these cloths were made on traditional Indonesian looms. Up to now, there's been no suggestion that any Indian weavers crossed the ocean to Java or Sumatra. This makes the loom used by this weaver in Balai Cacang particularly interesting. The arrangement of the loom near the cloth beam is similar to that found on other looms in this area. What makes the loom special is the arrangement for tensioning the warp. Instead of the large, flat warp beam seen on most looms in this area, the warp passes around a pair of rods at the back of the loom, which are attached to a heavier beam behind them. This is tied to an upright post, which is supported by stones. As the weaving progresses, the weaver gradually loosens the cords so that the warp rods move closer to the cloth beam. This arrangement is not used anywhere else in Indonesia, as far as we know, but it is used in most parts of India, where it's the traditional arrangement for suspending a warp. The warp may be tied off by the back post, as with this loom used by Indian patola weavers in Patan, or it can be tied off at a post next to the weaver, as with this loom used by a Mashru weaver nearby. The same arrangement can be seen in this old photograph of a pit loom in use near Hyderabad. The attachment of the tensioning cord to the post is the same as that used by the Balai Cacang weaver. This is significant because it's evidence that Indian weavers probably travelled to Sumatra at some point in the past. Designs on cloths can be copied very easily, but technique travels much more slowly. The warping system is not obvious, and it would take a skilled weaver who was experienced in the Indian warping method to explain it and teach it to an Indonesian weaver. So, as far as we know, this is the first evidence that Indian weavers, as well as Indian cloths, crossed the ocean to Indonesia. Exactly when this took place is unknown, but it is likely to have happened before the introduction of Malaysian frame loom weaving technology from the north. It was probably associated with the making of Indian-style cloths for the local Sumatran market. So what have we found in the course of our research? The first thing is that some of the oldest techniques involving bamboo lidi as a patterning system still survive, mostly within individual households who've been weaving for generations, who are amongst the most conservative of the weavers in the Minangkabau area, and who are not particularly interested in efficiency, more in maintaining their family traditions. In contrast, the commercial workshops, which also have a very long history, are much more innovative and much more accepting of new techniques. We've also, as I've mentioned, found evidence that weaving technology actually crossed the Indian Ocean from India to Indonesia, which we believe is the first positive identification of technology as opposed to textiles crossing the ocean.
Great. The only thing I would like to add is that if we go back to the Songket textiles, that these are luxurious goods. These are the kind of textile that's always associated with prestige, wealth, and ceremonies. So to some degree, they're also associated with commerce and commercial workshops. And as you had said, this type of workshop are usually more innovative than the home-based producers because they have to keep up with the modern trend, the contemporary needs. And the role of scholars, as we see it, and of the Tracing Patterns Foundation in particular, is to document and record traditional techniques while they're still alive today, but also to record these changes, this new type of techniques that's emerging now, as also an important record. And we don't advocate the return to the past if it's not viable in terms of practice, but rather to see this trajectory of change as part of the living traditions. So we applaud the Minang weavers for being able to continue to maintain their crafts, to be relevant and economically viable in today's modern world.
And to make their own decisions about what their weaving tradition will consist of in the future.
Yeah.